Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 663. Today is August 23rd, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Some important news to talk about on today's show, but first need to mention the sponsor of the show, and that is the Expat Money Summit 2024, which is the world's largest offshore event taking place entirely online from October 7th through the 11th. Speakers include myself, Dave DeCamp, and Horvoya Morik on a panel about World War III. Is it a genuine concern or just fear-mongering? But if that lineup isn't enough to get you to attend, Ron Paul, Tom Woods, Scott Horton will all also be speaking. So just an absolutely star-studded lineup for the event. Now, there's a lot you can learn. It's not just foreign policy. They're going to talk about why you may want to move abroad and then what the benefits of that would be and how to accomplish that. How do you buy international real estate? How do you get a second passport? So you can find out some of that information at this summit as well. So expatmoneysummit.com. Again, that's expatmoneysummit.com. Or you could use the links in the show notes page. There's two links. The first one is my affiliate link to get your complimentary ticket to the Expat Money Summit. So you could just click that. If you want a ticket to the VIP event, you could save $100 by using the promo code Kyle, K-Y-L-E, when you check out, or just click the second link in the show notes page for the Expat Money Summit, and you will be able to just have that autofill in for you, and you will get your $100 discount. Either way, for those of you who get your free ticket or your VIP ticket, I really appreciate anyone who is supporting the sponsor of the show. All right, everyone, let's jump into the news today. First story I have here, I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on August 22nd. Ukrainian commanders blame poorly trained soldiers for Donbass losses. So as Kiev attempts to bask in triumph over its territorial gains inside of Russia, its forces are losing territory at an increasing rate along the eastern front lines in Ukraine. Ukrainian military commanders say the reason for the losses is poorly trained soldiers, many who are too afraid to even fire their weapons. So speaking with the Associated Press, a battalion commander in Ukraine's 47th Brigade said some people don't want to shoot. They see the enemy in firing position in trenches but don't open fire. That's why our men are dying. They don't use the weapons. They are ineffective. And so you could certainly imagine this being a major problem along the front lines and probably, within the ranks of the soldiers as well. If, you're conducting some kind of maneuvers or operations and you expect that the guy next to you is going to be laying down cover fire or be shooting at the trench, across from you is a part of, the operations. You're going to take out this guy. He's going to take out that guy. Well, if the guy watching your back is afraid to shoot his gun, then your bat's going to get shot. And that's a real problem for the Ukrainians on the front lines right now. I'm guessing it's a result of kind of what's happened over the past 2.5 years, where, initially at first in the invasion, you did have a lot of willing recruits going and signing up, very enthusiastic. You had Western countries pledging to train these soldiers. Ukraine already had a couple 100,000 men within their military, so you probably could have months of these new recruits going abroad, Germany, the UK, US, anywhere in NATO, Poland, Romania, things like that, where they're going to receive training from NATO instructors. Now, you do have to imagine that this is probably not the best way to train an army, to have the Brits train part of the army, have the Germans train another part, the Americans, the French, the Italians, right? That this is probably going to lead to at least some level of disorientation, maybe different kinds of phrasing is used. And I know these are all NATO states, but still, languages are different, militaries are different, the equipment, the kinds of weapons they use across all these countries is slightly different. For example, the Americans use the Abrams tanks, the Brit use the Challenger tanks, the Germans use the Leopard tanks. And so, obviously the training is going to be somewhat different from country to country. And I had to imagine that this is also causing a problem for the Ukrainians. But it seems like the current problem that they're really having is that these men just aren't trained enough. Either they don't know how to use their weapons, how to use their rifles, or they're unwilling to. Now, the unwilling segment, you have to also assume that a part of the problem that's adding to that is that Ukraine has had to increasingly rely on conscription as we've gone through the war. As I said, at first, you had a lot of people signing up, a lot of nationalist energy in Ukraine to sign up and fight off the invading Russians. But over the 2.5 years, that has really waned. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think maybe one of the easier ones to point to would be the summer counteroffensive in 2023, where the US and NATO pushed Ukraine to launch these operations. Well, the problem was they telegraphed those operations for months. And so, well equipped, with NATO weaponry, again, the Challengers, the Leopards, these advanced tanks, HIMARS systems, American air defense systems, and things like that. All these were put in place for the Ukrainians. However, since it was telegraphed for months, the Russians had well-entrenched defensive, multiple lines of minefields, and the Ukrainians, as Daniel Davis pointed out, effectively ran into a buzzsaw. And the West pushed Kiev to keep throwing its soldiers into this buzzsaw, saying, eventually you'll dole out and wear out these blades. But that never actually happened, and more Ukrainians just kept dying and dying and dying. And that did seem to be a real morale hit for the Ukrainians. And almost maybe when we look back in history, a second phase of the war starting then, where up until that point, the Ukrainians could tout a little bit of success. They had a fall offensive in 2022 that was, I wouldn't say overwhelmingly successful. They didn't really retake the territory that they had their eye on, which was in southeastern Ukraine, but they were able to take territory around the Kharkiv region in northeastern Ukraine. And so, they were supposed to be building on the success of that counteroffensive to launch another one the following summer. That would have been last year, 2023. And of course, the dismal failure there led to more losses across the entire front lines, particularly again in the east and the south, where Russia really wants territory, Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhia. And so this, was a major failure for the Ukrainians, that counteroffensive. So, back to my article here. After pushing Kiev to forgo a diplomatic settlement with Moscow in April 2022, Western leaders pledged that they would arm, equip, and train Ukrainian soldiers to fight off the Russian invaders. However, 2.5 years into the conflict, it has turned into a war of attrition, and Kiev's backers are struggling to sustain Ukraine's military amid the massive losses. While Ukraine has not made an official statement regarding its casualties, the estimates are they are estimated to be well into the hundreds of thousands. Support for the war has dipped in Ukraine, leading Kiev to draft more Ukrainians, including increasingly young civilians, into the military. Many of the recruits and conscripts receive training in NATO countries, but their commanders are not performing routine operations. They are not performing routine operations on the battlefield. So this is what one commander told the AP. From the command point, I would like to issue orders to small infantry groups, but I am not sure if they are capable of executing these orders because they lack coordination and communications. And I'm not going to read the next line just because I'm worried it might trip up the YouTube algorithms. But if you guys check out my article at the Libertarianista, you can. It's kind of superfluous to the discussion here. So one of the soldiers said that the experience is leading to territorial losses. The soldier said, the main problem is the survival instinct of the newcomers. Before, people could stand until the last moment to hold the position. Now, even when there's light shelling of firing positions, they are retreating. And the commander of the 47th Battalion added, the fear creates panic and chaos. This is also the reason why we have lost. So just, it's not going very well for the Ukrainians. And a part of that is the training, which is compounded by the massive losses, which, of course, really escalated during last summer's counteroffensive. And it seems like we really trace a lot of the problems that Ukraine is now facing back to then, when they just shouldn't have carried out that counteroffensive in the way they did, but it was the U.S. that pushed them to do it. All right, next up here, this one, Day to Camp, August 22nd, antiwar.com. Russia says it used, or Ukraine says it used U.S.-made GBU-39 bombs inside Russia. So the Ukrainian Air Force said Thursday that its forces used a U.S.-made GBU 39 small diameter bomb in a strike on a Russian platoon in Russia's Kursk Oblast, Reuters reported on Thursday. The GBU-39 is a 250-pound bomb that's typically fired from aircraft. The U.S. has also provided Ukraine with a land-based version that can be fired from HIMARS rockets, known as the ground-launched small-diameter bomb. These were actually made for the war in Ukraine because the U.S. wasn't planning to give Ukraine advanced NATO-made warplanes like the F-16s, which we ultimately ended up transferring to Ukraine. And so essentially what they did, they put a pretty large rocket motor on the GBU-39 bomb and a glide system on it. So the rocket propels it up in the air, then it has a glide, some kind of glide targeting system when it comes down. Or at least that's how it's supposed to be designed. This was something that the weapons maker actually proposed to the U.S. when they were just throwing money at absolutely anyone for the war in Ukraine. So on Wednesday, the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces said their soldiers were using U.S.-provided HIMARS systems to destroy pontoon bridges and engineering equipment inside of Kursk. While the U.S. claims that it was unaware of Ukraine's plans to invade Kursk until the assault started on August 6th, Washington is still strongly backing the operation by allowing the use of U.S.-provided weapons. And I've said on this show, I am very highly skeptical that these operations occurred without U.S. foreknowledge. One, that means that Ukraine was using some of the moving around some of the most advanced systems we gave them, seemingly, hundreds of miles from either the Donbass or southern Ukraine all the way up to northern Ukraine, and the U.S. had no idea that. We don't know where they're taking these ground-launched small-diameter bombs before they do it, or the HIMARS systems, or the armored infantry vehicles that we've given Ukraine. We don't know what's going on, where these systems are being deployed within the country, because this should be a major concern, right? The U.S. has said time and time again that we're monitoring the weapons we give Ukraine to make sure they're not being smuggled. Well, if suddenly millions of dollars of American weapons are being moved away from what is supposed to be the battlefield in the front lines, the Americans need to be asking questions to the Ukrainians. Where the hell are these weapons going? These are weapons that we gave them. And so, if the Americans didn't know that this operation was going to be underway, it seems to me there can't be very good monitoring of U.S. weapons inside of Ukraine. And that's really problematic for other reasons. I do think that the Americans knew, and that they're just not saying. I imagine they also helped the Ukrainians plan the operations. I'm sure our intelligence and targeting that we are providing them are absolutely crucial. If these HIMARS systems are being used to hit bridges or makeshift bridges that Russia is trying to roll out dozens or hundreds of miles from Ukrainian positions, well, how is Ukrainian getting accurate enough intelligence to hit these targets without the American support? That would be a major question. And so it seems to me that the only possible explanation is not only are the Americans very aware that these operations were planned and are now underway, but they aided in that as well. Okay, so to finish up Dave's article here, the U.S. is expected to announce a new weapons package for Ukraine on Friday. Amid the fighting in Kursk, U.S. officials told the Associated Press it would be worth $125 million and include munition for HIMARS systems, air defense missiles, artillery shells, Javelin anti-tank weapons, and other types of equipment. Heavy fighting has continued in Kursk through this week, and also along the eastern front in Ukraine's Donbass region, where Russian forces have been making steady gains. There's no end in sight to the violence, as Russia has ruled out peace talks with the Ukraine following the assault in Kursk. All right, one more story on the war in Ukraine here. This one, again, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, August 22nd. European Union's top diplomat calls for supporting long-range strikes in Russia. So Josep Borrell, the top diplomat for the European Union, called on Wednesday for Western countries that are providing weapons to Ukraine to lift restrictions to allow long-range strikes inside Russia with NATO weapons. The U.S. is allowing Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons inside of Kursk, but is not permitting them to be used in long-range strikes. Borrell wrote on Twitter, Ukraine's Kursk offensive is a severe blow to Russian President Putin's narrative, lifting restrictions on the use of capabilities versus the Russian military involved in aggressive actions against Ukraine in accordance with international law would have several important effects. Borrell claimed that allowing long-range strikes would help peace efforts, but Russia is ruling out any negotiations with Ukraine in the wake of the Kursk offensive, which was launched on August 6th. Ukrainian President Zelensky is pushing hard for the U.S. and NATO to lift all restrictions on the use of their weapons and has called his Western backers' concerns about potential escalation naive. In the meantime, Ukraine has been stepping up larger range attacks inside Russia using drones. So Zelensky said last week, our Ukrainian drones work exactly as they should, but there are things that cannot be done with drones alone. Unfortunately, we need other weapons, missile weapons. While Zelensky is downplaying the risk of major Russian response, the U.S.-backed invasion of Russian territory and the use of NATO weapons inside Russia, the Russian mainland, marked a huge escalation in Russia. So this is a major concern for me, and I think everybody should be fairly concerned about this escalation. Now, this is the statement by Borrell is somewhat interesting because Zelensky has been kind of hinting that the assault inside Russia, the purpose of it was to, at least in part, convince his Western backers that they can support deep strikes inside of Russian territory without a major Russian response. Now, I think in the West, we're very impatient. And so the idea that Russia would issue its main response to this Ukrainian invasion right away, I think is a mistake. Obviously, Russia is going to work to expel the invaders immediately, although even then they didn't just throw resources at the problem. It seems that the Russians did this in a way where they still prioritized taking and making their steady gains inside of Ukrainian territory versus taking back the Kursk region as quickly as possible. And so the idea that we're going to see the real Russian response to this immediately, I think, is a mistake. Russia may take some time, figure out calculations, because Putin is going to want to escalate in a way that doesn't lead to a counter escalation by the West that puts Russia in bigger jeopardy, right? I think he wants to be very calculated in how he decides to respond to this provocation. And so assuming that Putin isn't going to respond is a real mistake, but that seems to be what Borrell is hinting at here, that, hey, Putin isn't going to do what we thought he might do, and so therefore we should just keep escalating and doing more and more and more, basically push the Russians until Putin does something like strike a NATO country or carry out a major bombing of a Ukrainian city, a decapitation strike against the Ukrainian state. Will something like that happen if the West continues to escalate? I think it's very possible. All right, a couple stories dealing with the South China Sea region here and, just China's near abroad as America continues to ramp up its military activity in the region. So China says it's gravely concerned over a report on new U.S. nuclear strategy. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry said Wednesday that it was gravely concerned over a report from the New York Times that said President Biden approved a new nuclear strategy that focuses on China for the first time. The strategy, which Biden approved in March, also includes preparations for a simultaneous nuclear war with Russia, China, North Korea, another first. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said, China is gravely concerned over the report. As we have seen over the past few years, the U.S. has called China a nuclear threat and used a convenient pretext to shrink its obligation of nuclear disarmament, expand its own nuclear arsenal, and seek absolute strategic predominance. Current estimates put China's nuclear arsenal at around 500 warheads. The Pentagon claims Beijing is on track to have 1,500 by 2035. China acknowledges that it's modernizing its nuclear arsenal, but has previously denied the U.S. claims that it is rapidly building up its stockpile. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry said the size of China's nuclear arsenal is by no means on the same level as the U.S. China follows a policy of no first-use nuclear weapons and a nuclear strategy that focuses on self-defense and keeping its nuclear capabilities at the minimum level required by national security. We have no intention to engage in any form of arms race with any other country. The spokeswoman added that it is the U.S. that, quote, sits on the largest and most advanced nuclear arsenal in the world. The State Department said in July that the U.S. has 5,748 warheads, including 2,000 that are retired and awaiting dismantlement. According to the Arms Control Association, Russia has 5,580 warheads, including 1,200 that are retired and awaiting dismantlement. Mao called for the U.S. to work to dismantle most of its arsenal. China urges the U.S. to fulfill its special and primary obligation of nuclear dismantlement by further making drastic and substantive cuts to its nuclear arsenal and stop its nuclear sharing, extended deterrence, expanding nuclear alliance, and other negative moves that undermine global and regional peace and stability, she said. All right, now we have a very big provocation in the Taiwan Strait. U.S. Navy destroyer transits through Taiwan Strait. So the U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Ralph Johnson, sailed through the sensitive Taiwan Strait on Thursday, drawing protests from China. So senior Chinese Colonel Li Shi, the spokesperson for the Chinese military's Eastern Theater Command, said air and sea assets were deployed to monitor the U.S. warship as it traveled through the strait. This is the quote: "The Eastern Theater Command remains on high alert and will resolutely safeguard national sovereignty and security, as well as regional peace and stability." The U.S. always frames its Taiwan Strait transits as routine, even though Beijing views them as provocations, and the tensions in the region have been especially high in recent years. So the U.S. Navy 7th Fleet said in a statement, the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Ralph Johnson is conducting a routine Taiwan Strait transit on August 22nd through waters that were high seas, freedom of navigation, and overflight apply in accordance with international law. So the last time a U.S. Navy warship transited the Taiwan Strait was in May. The U.S. had been encouraging allies to step up their presence near China's coast, and a Canadian frigate made the provocative trip through the strait on July 31st. At the time, Lee said that the Canadian frigate had harassed and disrupted the situation and undermined peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Of course, this is a very sensitive issue for China because it views Taiwan as a part of its own territory. And this is essentially, for China, the Americans sailing some of their most advanced warships right through Chinese waters off their coastline. All right, next up here, shifting over to the Middle East, with one update on ceasefire talks heading into the weekend. Blinken sentenced ceasefire talks to death with comments on Netanyahu. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken comments about Gaza ceasefire talks this week sentenced the negotiations to death, the Middle East Eye reported on Thursday, citing Israeli media. So after meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday, Blinken said the Israeli leader agreed to a new U.S. proposal, and it was now up to Hamas to agree to the deal. However, the U.S. proposal included new demands from Netanyahu that Hamas considers unacceptable. Israeli, U.S. and Arab sources have all said Netanyahu's demands are too hardline and will prevent a deal. Sources speaking with Ynet slammed Blinken for making the comments that portrayed Hamas as the obstacle to a deal. A source said, Blinken made a very serious foul here that indicates innocence, amateurism, naivety, and a lack of understanding. They added that Blinken's positive spin on ceasefire negotiations was likely an effort to prevent the situation from overshadowing the Democrat National Convention. The source said he broadcast optimism for intra-America political considerations so that the Democratic Convention in Chicago would go smoothly. But senior officials of the Israeli negotiating team who listened to his press conference wanted to dispel the speculations. The source explained, The source called Blinken's comments a gift to Netanyahu and said the Israeli leader continued insistence that Israel must maintain control of the Egypt-Gaza border, known as the Philadelphia corridor, will prevent a deal. There is no deal and there is no summit if the Israeli insistence on deploying forces along the Philadelphia axis continues. What was implied in Blinken's words is that the U.S. is giving Netanyahu support for the IDF to remain in the Philadelphia, while both the Egyptians refuse and Hamas refuses, the source explained. So, U.S. and Israeli officials are due to meet again in Cairo this week to discuss the ceasefire, but Arab mediators have said there's no point of holding talks unless the U.S. puts significant pressure on Netanyahu to back down from his demands and agree to a deal. And this is what I've been explaining really through the course of this week, right? That what the Americans did during these negotiations was accept all of Netanyahu's demands and then claim that once again, it's Hamas that's preventing a deal. And they were doing this for American domestic political consumption. It's absolutely sick. Speaking of domestic American politics, that's where we're going to wrap up the show for today. Democrats refuse to let Palestinian Americans speak at the DNC. So the Democratic Party has refused to allow a Palestinian American to speak at the Democratic National Convention despite pressure from delegates. So the request for a Palestinian to speak at the DNC was made by members of the Uncommitted National Movement, who represent hundreds of thousands of people who voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries to protest President Biden's support for the genocidal war in Gaza. Uncommitted delegates proposed several speakers, including Palestinian Americans and Dr. Trina Haj Hassan, who volunteered at a hospital in Gaza and shared the horrors that she witnessed at an event on the sidelines of the DNC. The leader of the uncommitted movement said the Democratic Party leadership said no to the speaking request. Uncommitted delegates staged a sit-in on Wednesday to protest the decision and are still pushing for a speaker for Thursday, which is the final day of the DNC. Ryan Grimm, a reporter for Dropside News, wrote on X that the DNC had told uncommitted delegates that no Palestinian will be allowed to speak from the stage, even with a vetted speech. The parents of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, an Israeli American being held hostage in Gaza, spoke at the DNC on Wednesday, which was supported by the uncommitted movement. They called for a ceasefire and a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. Despite the pressure the Democratic Party is facing to alter its policy towards Israel, the new platform makes an ironclad commitment to continue support providing Israel with military aid. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris both claim they're working on a ceasefire deal, but there's no sign that the administration is willing to put real pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to a deal. In the meantime, the genocidal slaughter continues and dozens of Palestinians, including many children, are being killed by Israeli strikes every day. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today and listening all week. I really appreciate it. Once again, just here at the end of the show, remind everybody that me and my wife are expecting our first child, and I will be taking a couple weeks off after she is born, sometime within the next few weeks. So if you stop seeing conflicts of interest in your feed, that is why. If you head on over to Twitter and follow me at @KyleAnzalone_, I likely will post a few updates during that time, just what's going on, in my personal life, and, hopefully that everything's going well. So anyways, thank you all again so much for tuning in. Back with more shows next week.